To conclude the Second World War in Europe, we will go over a little more detail now on the Normandy landings. As the gray, misty light of dawn broke on D-Day morning, June the 6th, 1944, the largest invasion fleet in history, some 5,300 Allied ships carrying 370,000 soldiers and sailors, filled the horizon off the Normandy coast. Sleepy German soldiers guarding the beaches awoke to see Allied ships of every size. A French boy said he saw more ships than sea. And when Hitler learned of the Allied landings, he boasted that the news couldn't be better. As long as the Allied armies, were in Britain, we couldn't get at them. Now we have them where we can destroy them. In the United States, word that the long-anticipated liberation of Nazi Europe had begun captured the nation's attention. Businesses closed, church bells tolled, and traffic stopped so that people could pray in the streets. Churchill called the D-Day invasion undoubtedly the most complicated and difficult military operation in history. During the first day of the Normandy landings, rough seas caused injuries and nausea and capsized dozens of landing craft. Indeed, many of them never managed to land at all, and over 1,000 men, weighed down by their packs and equipment, drowned as they stepped off the landing craft into water over their heads. Some of the landing craft delivered their often seasick troops to the wrong location. "We have landed in the wrong place," shouted Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., the son of the former president, who would receive the Medal of Honor for his courage that day. "But we will start the war from here." The noise was deafening as the shells exploded across the beach and in the surf. The bodies of the killed, wounded, and drowned piled up amid the wrenching cries for help. As our boat touched sand and the ramp went down, Private Harry Parley remembered, I became a visitor to help. The first U.S. units ashore at Omaha Beach beneath the 130-foot tall cliffs, defended by German machine guns and mortars, lost more than 90% of their men. Sword, Juno, and Utah beaches were the other landing sites at Normandy. Officers struggled to rally the exhausted, bewildered men pinned down on the beach. "There are two kinds of men staying on this beach," shouted Colonel George Taylor on Omaha Beach. "The dead and those who are going to die. Get up, move in, goddammit, move in and die." Inch by inch, the U.S. soldiers pushed across the beach and up the cliffs. By nightfall, 156,000 Allied soldiers, 57,000 of them Americans, were scattered across 50 miles of Normandy coastline. So, too, were the bodies of some 5,000 dead and wounded Allied soldiers. Omaha was where the brunt of the casualties took place. On June 13th, a week after the Normandy landings, Erwin Rommel, the German commander, told his wife that the battle is not going at all well for us. Within 3 weeks, the Allies had landed more than 1 million troops, 566,000 tons of supplies, and 171,000 vehicles. Whether the enemy can still be stopped at this point is questionable. German headquarters near Paris warned Hitler, "The enemy air superiority is terrific and smothers almost every one of our movements. Losses in men and equipment are extraordinary." Operation Overlord was the greatest seaborne invasion in the annals of warfare, but it was small when compared with the offensive launched by the Soviets a few weeks after D-Day. Between June and August 1944, the Soviet army killed, wounded, or captured more German soldiers, 350,000, than were stationed in all of Western Europe. That's just incredible numbers. Still, the Normandy invasion was the turning point in the war, as we mentioned in Part 1. With the beachhead secured, Allied leaders knew that victory was in their grasp. "What a plan!" Churchill exclaimed to the British Parliament. For all the Allied success, however, Eisenhower privately struggled with the daily casualty reports. "How I wish this cruel business of war could be completed quickly," he wrote his wife. "The liberation of Paris will be next, but it would take 7 more weeks and 37,000 more lives to gain control of Normandy." The Germans lost more than twice as many. Some 19,000 French civilians died in the carnage. Then, on July 25th, 1944, the American armies broke out from Normandy and headed east towards Paris. And on August 15th, a joint American-French invasion force landed on the French Mediterranean coast and raced up the Rhone Valley in eastern France. That's Patton's armies. The path to victory in France was anything but smooth. German resistance collapsed only after 10 weeks of ferocious fighting. A division of the Free French Resistance, aided by American units, had the honor of liberating Paris on August 25th. As American soldiers marched through the city's cheering crowds, a reporter said that he had never seen in any place such joy as radiated from the people of Paris this morning. By mid-September, most of France and Belgium had been cleared of German troops. Meanwhile, the Soviet army moved relentlessly westward along a 1,200-mile front, pushing the fleeing Germans out of Russia. Between D-Day until the end of the war in Europe a year later, 1.2 million Germans were killed and wounded. And Roosevelt will be elected to his 4th term in 1944, again with decisive numbers for the 4th consecutive unprecedented time. And Yalta will take place, and that's the big three, a famous iconic photo here of them meeting in February of 1945. And they will discuss how to divide post-war Germany and Eastern Europe at this conference. And many conservatives accuse FDR of selling out American interests at this conference because they decided to allow the Soviets to control Eastern Germany. And the Americans and British would take charge of the industrial areas in the West. Berlin would be subject to a joint occupation by France, Britain, United States, and the Soviet Union. Stalin's goals at Yalta were both defensive and expansive. He wanted to retrieve the former Russian territory ceded to Poland after World War I and to impose Soviet control over the countries of Eastern and Central Europe, and that's going to happen. More on that in the Cold War. Roosevelt was exhausted and failing health. You can see that from the picture. If you go back and look at it, he looks very haggard. And he agreed to most of these demands because he seeks Soviet aid in helping to defeat Japan. The analysts believed that Japan would be able to hold out for another 18 months after the defeat of Germany. And finally, Nazi Germany is going to collapse. By early 1945, they're on the verge of defeat, but President Roosevelt would not live to join the victory celebrations. In the spring of 1945, he goes to the little White House where there is a spa and mineral springs that he'd like to get in to help his polio-ravaged body. And on April the 12th, 1945, he complained of a headache, but he seemed to be in good spirits, pleasantly distracted by his beloved stamp collection. And at midday, he told an artist painting his portrait that we've got about 15 minutes more to work. Then as she watched him reading some documents, he groaned, saying that he had a terrific pain in the back of his head. Then he slumped over and fell into a coma, and he died 2 hours later from a massive stroke. Roosevelt's death shocked and saddened people all over the world. Even his sharpest critics were devastated. Ohio Senator Robert Taft, known as Mr. Republican, called Roosevelt's death one of the worst tragedies in American history. The president's death removes the greatest figure of our time at the very climax of his career. He dies a hero of the war, for he literally worked himself to death in the service of the American people. By contrast, a desperate Adolf Hitler saw in Roosevelt's death a great miracle for the besieged Germans. "The war is not lost," he told an aide. "Read it. Roosevelt is dead." But Hitler's shrinking Nazi empire collapsed less than a month later. And in Berlin, as Soviet troops entered the German capital, Adolf Hitler married his mistress, Eva Braun, in an underground bunker on the last day of April. She then poisoned herself, and he killed himself with a pistol shot. 2 days later, on May the 2nd, Berlin fell. And 5 days later, on May 7th, the Chief of Staff of the German Armed Forces, signed a treaty agreeing to unconditional surrender. So ended the Nazi domination of Europe a little more than 12 years after Hitler had come to power, proclaiming his 1,000-year Reich. And on May 8th, VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, generated massive celebrations everywhere. And the Holocaust is revealed. By the end of the war in Europe, the extent of the Holocaust, the systematic efforts, the genocide of the Jews for whom Hitler had an obsessive hatred, came to light. Reports of this methodical slaughter had appeared as early as 1942, but the ghastly stories of millions killed in gas chambers seemed beyond belief until the Allied armies liberated the death camps in Central and Eastern Europe. There the Germans had imposed their final solution to what Hitler called the Jewish problem. And this wholesale extermination of some 6 million Jews and more than 1 million other captured peoples was revealed. In 1945, Allied troops were horrified at what they discovered in the concentration camps. Bodies were piled as high as buildings. Survivors were virtually skeletons. And General Eisenhower reported to his wife that the evidence of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. American officials, even some Jewish leaders, had dragged their feet in acknowledging the Holocaust during the war for fear that relief efforts for Jewish refugees might stir up anti-Semitism at home. And under pressure, Roosevelt had set up the War Refugee Board early in 1944. It managed to rescue about 200,000 European Jews and some 20,000 others. Overall, however, the Allied response to the Nazi atrocities was inept at best and disgraceful at worst. In 1944, Churchill called the Holocaust the most horrible crime ever committed in the history of the world. And there's what some of the survivors looked like, and they tattooed their prisoners on their chest or under their arms sometimes. And this gentleman is very glad to see the Allies. And so ends the war in Europe. And in the next part, we will go over the war in the Pacific and a little bit further on plans for the post-war world.